All right, now over to email.
Hello, everyone. So my questions, I have two questions, short questions. Does every action start from intent? And also, can you set the intent without even knowing, like unconsciously?
Yeah, yes to both of those. Every action starts with an intention. There has to be some reason for that interaction, some thing to make it happen, to make it take place. So there is an intent. Now that intent doesn't have to be necessarily well developed, or it could maybe even be the result of a random draw, but something has to create the move to do something. So yes, all actions kind of flow from an intention of some sort, and intentions are often not in your intellect. You're not necessarily aware of those intents. Now, as you get rid of your fear, which also gets rid of your ego and gets rid of your beliefs, you become aware of all of you, in which case at that point, you probably would be aware of all of your intents. But in as much as that you still have some fear, there's parts of you that what Freud called the subconscious. The subconscious is that part of us that we really don't want to deal with, that we can't deal with very effectively, and we don't want to deal with it. So we stuff it in a space that our intellect doesn't go. And most of our fear is in a space like that. Most of our fears, we don't, I'm not talking about, fear of large cats or, fear of snakes or something. It's a fear of being inadequate or not being good enough or not being lovable. These kinds of things live outside of our intellect. Most people that have them aren't aware of them. Some people that have them are aware of them. But once you lose your fear, you'll be aware of all of that. So for most people, most of the time, yes, there are intents that you are not aware of. For those who have gotten rid of most of their fear, then that's less and less true.
Okay. And let's say in a meditative state, when you set your intent, does it has to feel like something? For example, when I meditate and I get into theta state, I will know 100% that I'm there at that right time. But when I set the intent, I'm not sure if I'm doing it right or it has to feel somehow.
When you're not sure, that's generally your intellect trying to manage the situation. Because all day in the virtual reality we call the physical universe, our intellect guides us through it, tells us, whether we're doing it right or doing it wrong, or it's judging, it's assessing, it's analyzing, and we kind of live by that intellect. And then we get into an intuitive space like in meditation, and that intellect doesn't want to let go of that. It wants to keep doing that. It keeps to assessing and questioning and judging. Well, are you doing it right? Are you in the right state? Have you gotten there yet? And that's your intellect trying to run your life as it normally does. But of course, that gets in the way. Whenever your intellect gets in the way, it basically bumps you out of that intuitive state. Now you're back in the intellect, not in the intuitive state anymore. Eventually, your intellect and your intuition will learn to share and work together. But initially, for most people, that's not true. You kind of are in one space or the other. It's hard to be in both at the same time. So yes, when you're second guessing yourself, or am I there yet? Am I doing it right? That's the intellect. And if you can just let that go then and still be there, that's fine. Then you're in your your intellect and your intuition are kind of working together. That's not a problem. You can jump in and out, back and forth between those two very easily. And that's a cooperative mode. But when let's say you're going to use your intention to heal someone, you're going to use your mind to help somebody who's ill get better. Well, your intellect may set that intention. Oh, I want to heal Uncle Fred today when I meditate. So that's your intellect setting the direction. But then you get into the meditation state and you start working on Uncle Fred, you have to be completely in the intuitive state as you work on Uncle Fred. But you could jump back out of it and say, well, gee, I forgot to work on Uncle Fred's feet. Let me go back in and do it again. Now that's the intellect, you see, coming in, doing a little analysis, saying, oh, you didn't do it right, and going back. And it's fine to work that way. That's not a problem. Just as long as when you actually do your healing, you're working from an intuitive space, because your intellectual space has no ability to heal. It doesn't move, probability. The intellect can make wishes, but they're not very powerful. It's that intuitive space is where you actually can make things happen. So it's no problem jumping back and forth as long as it's a nice clean jump and you're okay with it. The problem comes when your intellect kind of butts in and takes over when you don't want it to.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Daniel, over to you.
Thanks, Vanessa. Good to see you, Tom. I have a client who's going through a lot of challenges, and one of the questions that she asked me, and I didn't have an idea, was when does a fetus actually become an IOUC?
There's not a set time when that happens. It can happen in over a fairly wide span. Often the IUOC will log on being a metaphor, will start receiving data, start making choices and receiving data while when that fetus can start experiencing. When that fetus can hear or taste or see. Now, it doesn't have to necessarily see clearly, but even just light and dark and sounds and touch and pushing against the inside of the uterus and, touch. If it has sensory input, then that's data. And at any time, the IUOC can log on and start experiencing that input, that data. Now, there's not a lot of choice making going on there, but there's some choice making going on. And the IUOC could wait until after birth. It could probably even wait until 3 or 4 months after the birth before it logs on. And nobody would know, so it can happen in all sorts of different ways. So it doesn't have to happen just at any particular time. But as far as considerations with abortion, I would say that the IUOC, no matter when it logs on, early on has a very small investment in that particular lifetime because it hasn't made a lot of choices yet. So its investment is small, and therefore, if it had to start over, it wouldn't lose much, investment. It would just have to start over. Oh, well, try again. You see, it's not a really big deal. Now, the longer you go, the more investment it might have, in the sense that if it started early, it would know mom's voice and dad's voice, and it would know brothers and sisters' voices, and it would have a sense of feeling and connecting with those individuals. So now it's got a little bit of an investment in, but still not very much. I've even known some situations where an infant was born, had serious medical issues. The entity that had logged onto that said, "Oh, hey, this is not what I bargained for. So I'd like to back out." And some other entity comes along and says, "Oh, I'll take that. I think that would be very interesting. I could use that." And they may make a switch. You see, now that's not like every day. That's way down, in the margins. It doesn't happen often, but it's a fluid situation. Lots of different things can happen, but as long as the investment is small, then the loss is small if it's terminated.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Okay, so over to Marco.
Hello, Tom. Thank you, Vanessa. So I'm a little nervous to ask this question because it can get a little personal, but I think it's an honest question. So here I am. So some years ago, there was a filmmaker that wanted to make a documentary film about you, and he asked you what superpower would you have if you were a superhero, and you mentioned that you would be the Love Man. So he wanted to title the film Love Man, which is a wonderful nickname, and probably everybody agrees on that. So that's on one side. On the other side, anyone that knows a little bit about your biography knows that you are remarried and you have 3 children. You had 3 children with the second marriage and 1 child with the first one. So my question comes in twofold. So why could the Love Man get divorced? And the second part of it would be, what is a love-based way to deal with separation, given that most often what we know about separation comes with a lot of drama, and so usually it's not an easy process. So I could like your input about that.
Okay. No, that's not too personal. I don't mind. I'm pretty much open to talk about anything. Actually, that first marriage, and you probably don't know this part of the history, but in that first marriage, leading up to that marriage, before that first marriage took place, I had some conversation with the LCS, and I was told that that marriage is not going to last. That marriage isn't going to go but so far. And I thought, well, wait a minute. If it's not going to last, then why would I want to start? That wouldn't be, it's not a good thing to do. If it's not going to last, then I need to find somebody else in which it would last. And the system told me, no, this relationship is necessary for you. This relationship is what you need to grow, and it's what she needs to grow. And you both will grow a lot from it, but then it'll be best for your growth if you separate and go your own ways. And I really didn't like that. I was kind of uneasy with it, but eventually going back to the system, are you sure? Are you sure? And eventually the system convinced me, yes, that's just the way it's going to be. And I said, well, okay. So that was probably a year before the first marriage took place. Maybe a year and a half before the first marriage took place. And I knew starting that out that it was unlikely to go, but I didn't let that interfere with my thinking. Matter of fact, I just kind of pushed that out of my mind to where that wasn't part of my mind, in my intellect. It was still there. And if I thought about it, I could remember it, but I didn't dwell on it, or I didn't keep it in my mind. In other words, I didn't make that part of my reality. I let it go. It's going to be whatever it is. And my intention was for it to go the distance, to be something that worked good for both of us, the whole time, forever. Well, not forever, till death do us part. But it's not the way it worked out. It worked out just like I was told it would work out. And I was told that I would have a child when that relationship. And I was thinking, really, I should have a child in a relationship that's going to come apart? And I said, yes, you should. That's part of your learning. It's part of their learning. It's all going to work out fine. Trust me, it was that sort of thing. So I did trust them, and it did work out fine. So it just came to the point that we were very good for each other as far as learning and growing up to a certain point, then not quite so much. We both kind of needed different things and go in different ways to learn different lessons. And it was not a good idea to continue that. Phase 2 was in the wings, waiting. And phase 2 was going to take off then in a different direction, in a different way that was going to be more beneficial for both of us. So that's how it turned out that Love Man got a divorce. It was meant to happen that way. That was the low entropy path for everybody, for me, for the first wife, and for the son. That was the low entropy path for everybody. So it brings into question a belief that we have that meeting one person and staying with them forever is always the best thing and should be done at any cost. That's not necessarily the case. Sometimes the smart thing to do for both people is to separate. Sometimes not. It's an individual thing. So I was well aware of that and was told to just relax, go with it. It'll all work out. And so it did.
Thank you, Tom.
Excellent. Marco, was there 2 parts to that? I feel like there was.
Yeah, well, the second one was more about how to, you told us your story, which I appreciate you telling us that. What would be like the general advice for people dealing with any separation kind of process?
My advice for people living in what sort of process?
In a separation.
Oh.
Or getting divorced or.
Well, I think what they should think about is their potential and the potential of the other person. And I think, that if you look at your potential and you get into the future probable database and you kind of see how your potential develops in this situation and that situation, and if you're convinced that it's better for everybody to separate, then that's a good thing to do. If it's only good for one and not good for the other, well, then that's a lot more problematical. Then someone or you both should start thinking about how can you repair it? How can you fix it? How can you change? How can you grow into it? But if you end up with a situation that is good for both to separate, then separation is a good thing to do. So look at the potential of where you're going and think, how can I change? How can I be different such that this relationship I have will work better? Which is just the opposite of what most of us do. Most of us think, how should they change so that this relationship will work? That's the way we think. We just are. And of course, we always see ourselves as right. That's just because that's where we are. If it's our choice, then it's the right choice. And if other people are doing things that we think are dysfunctional, well, that's their problem to solve. So we tend to always see the problem in the other person, not in ourselves. So we should look at ourselves and say, what could I do? How can I change just to make this work better? And if making that change also requires you to grow up, like get rid of some ego and get rid of some beliefs, well, there you got a double winner. The relationship will get better and you'll grow up. You see, if the problem is your ego, because things aren't the way you want them, because that other person isn't the way you want them to be, well, that's your ego. I want, I need. You see, it's all about I. That's your being self-centered. Well, not being self-centered is a good thing. So if you're growing up and your relationship continuing both on the same path, that's kind of a no-brainer. You can go there. On the other hand, if the relationship is just toxic to the point that it's hurting everybody, including the children, then it's better to dissolve it. Do something more functional. But look at yourself for change first. And if the change that's required is one of getting rid of your ego, say, then maybe you're in a really good situation. It just happens to be painful right now. Until you grow up and change and get rid of that ego, then it would be less painful. Lots of possibilities, Marco. That's the thing. There's hundreds of different possibilities of ways that you could go. And you just have to pick the one that you think's the low entropy path and just go do it. See how it works out. If it doesn't work out, then make another decision.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. I think that's helpful. By the way, I'm not getting in that process, but it's really helpful because I can relate how in many situations I get challenged by my wife and the situation in general, and how that is so true that you have a tendency to blame to the other person instead of looking to yourself. So that's a great reminder for me to continue my path. Thank you very much, Tom.
Yeah. Well, you will find that your significant others, whoever that is, your significant other could be a wife or husband, or it could be your children, or it could be your best friend forever. But whoever your significant others are, those are your best teachers. Those are your most difficult teachers. It's those significant others that know how to twist your ego up in a knot. It's those significant others that challenge you in ego and those beliefs. You get challenged by them. So those are your good teachers, your best teachers, and your hardest teachers. I would say that, my wife is my best teacher. She challenges me more than anybody else could challenge me, because she's closer to me than anybody else. So I think that's true of everyone. The people you're closest to are the people who can challenge you the most effectively, which means they're wonderful teachers. Mm-hmm. Wonderful teachers. Yeah. You just have to see the problem as your problem to solve, not their problem to solve.
Mm-hmm. That's a great segue to our next question, because my significant other is on the call. So William has a question, nothing to do with relationships though, because I blame him for everything, and then he helps me to see how it's actually me blaming him, and then we resolve it.
Hi, Tom. So my question was really about just the simulation itself. What is the purpose behind, or do you have a theory behind what the purpose is of all this, of all the simulation? What's the goal of it?
Yes, definitely do. I can tell you're not real familiar with my work, William. If you were, you would know that, because that's kind of right out there in the front. But I can explain it to you very quickly. And that is, we have consciousness evolving, right? Consciousness is fundamental. Consciousness evolves. It starts out as one thing, one consciousness, one very small thing. Consciousness is awareness with a choice. So the smallest consciousness is just something that is aware that it can be in this state or that state. A binary, that's the simplest set of choices, right? Now, from there on, it has to evolve. So it evolves to have more choices, this way or that way and the other way. Now there's 3 choices. And you can think of choices as 1s and 0s. So, just differences. So anyway, it evolves as a monolithic thing, and it gets to a point where it can no longer evolve as quickly as it could before. And its solution to that is to break itself up into pieces, subsets of itself with free will. Because if it's just one thing, and what are the ideas one thing can come up with, that's limited compared to several things that all have free will, because now they're all going to have different opinions. And now suddenly you're going to get different ways of looking at the same problem. So it breaks into multiple things, each with free will, just subsets of the original thing that has all necessary to be conscious. And those interact. Now they form a social system. Eventually there's like thousands of things, and they form a social system. In a social system, in order to reduce entropy, and I guess I skipped that point, but if you're a system of consciousness, you're an information system. 1s, 0s, this way, that way. It's all about information. Information is what you're about, communicating with information. So in an information system, when the highest entropy state is when all the bits are random, high entropy. So by ordering bits, you create information. If you order bits and say, well, okay, here's a 0, 0, 1, 1, then I'm going to make that a symbol of something. So now you have a higher level of information. So anyway, that continues. And in order to lower entropy further, it has to break itself into pieces, because that gives it more choices, more things that it can become cooperatively rather than just as a simple thing. All right, now all those pieces are evolving. They're all trying to lower their entropy, create order, create information, understanding, and they're doing it as a collective. And as a collective, they find out that the way that works best, the way that they can reduce entropy the most, is by cooperating rather than each one just doing its own thing. Because now you just have if each one does its own thing, you just have a bunch of individual things. You've lost the power of cooperation and caring. So in a social system, cooperation, caring, working together is the optimal way to lower entropy. So that becomes the way forward for the social system. Now, in order to lower entropy, you need to make choices. And by those choices, if it's a low entropy choice, then you make more information, you create more order, and you evolve. Okay. Eventually, it gets harder and harder to lower entropy, just like it did for that monolithic thing. You start to slow down because the choices that you have, choices to cooperate, are basically the choices of a bunch of pieces of consciousness, like in a big chat room. So a lot of consciousness in a big chat room don't have real meaningful choices. Yes, they can cooperate. They can all play the same game. They can do things like that, but the consequences aren't all that big. So then the system realizes it needs a virtual reality in order to create more meaningful choices that will help these entities evolve more quickly, choices that have a lot of moral and ethical value to them, choices that are clearly low entropy or high entropy choices. And in order to do that, it starts with a set of initial conditions and a rule set, and lets that evolve. The initial conditions are a ball of plasma, high temperature, high pressure, under a little tiny spot in a little space. The rule set's what we call physics, and it pushes the run button. The plasma starts to expand, and that's the big digital bang. And it creates a virtual reality as it expands according to the rule set. Okay, so that's why we have the virtual reality that is the virtual reality we play in. It is a virtual reality that wasn't programmed, but evolved. It evolved to be an entropy reduction trainer, just like pilots go into a flight trainer first before they get into a big expensive airplane. They get into a flight trainer. This is an entropy reduction trainer for individuated units of consciousness. And here, because we have this tight rule set, the rule set defines all the things that can happen, all the things that are possible. That's basically the physics, the hard science, the chemistry, the biology. That's the rule set. And that just evolved from the rule set and initial conditions. We evolve our world. Okay, so that's really why we need the virtual reality. It's part of consciousness's strategy for its own evolution. Now, this consciousness system, which is the whole system, is continually evolving. It's not a finished product, including the original consciousness that started. It's still evolving as well. The pieces are all evolving. We're interacting with each other in this virtual reality. This virtual reality is not the only virtual reality. Other virtual realities are available as well. In fact, every reality in which you can experience things, an experiential reality, is a virtual reality. That defines a virtual reality. A virtual reality is defined as rules. To have a game, you need rules. If I say, okay, William, let's play a game. Okay, it's your turn, go. You can't do anything because there's no rules. The rules define the game. The rules create strategy and moves and things you can do, and choices are all created by rules that define how the interaction can take place. So if you have very tight rule set, like our physics, every interaction is pretty well defined. We call that, physical causality, right? Everything is interacting with everything else. Everything has a physical source, physical cause. Okay, that's a very tight rule set. If you have a loose rule set, like in a dream, well, it's not so tight. You can fly, you can teleport, you can do all kinds of things because the rule set is not all that tight as far as what you can and cannot do. So that's a different virtual reality. When you die, you end up in yet a different virtual reality. And there's other virtual realities with tight rule sets. Tight rule sets that make it very physical-like, because the system doesn't want all its eggs in one basket as far as its evolutionary trainers, if you will. They're different sorts. So that's why we have the virtual reality. That's what it's there for. It's for us to make choices, and our choices need to become love, caring, cooperation, all the things that within a social system lower entropy, because that's the way consciousness evolves. So does that all tie it all up into a
That does. Thank you for that.
So now we're going to hear from, CD.
Yes, thank you very much, Vanessa. Everybody can hear me? Is Tom there?
Here.
There is Tom. Hi, Tom. It's great to finally meet you and talk to you. And thanks for writing MBT, because it helped me tremendously in my life. So I have a question about evolution. I will read it to you. I wrote it down. It's a little bit long. Sorry about that, but here we go. According to scientific methods, we find that the fossils do not appear to change smoothly from one form to another, but present us with gaps. We cannot find a smooth transition of fossils from A to B, but rather an abrupt appearance from B in some point in time. Thus, there appears a gap in the fossil record between A and B. Some people think that the gaps in the fossil records present a problem to the theory of evolution, because they do not show a gradual and smooth change of one species changing into another. The idea that species morph gradually into another species is an old one. dating to Charles Darwin and Lamarck. Lamarck's theory was that individuals, not just species, could acquire novel traits from environment and pass them to their offspring. Georges Cuvier supported the theory of catastrophism, a consequence of which concluded that species appear relatively sudden after catastrophic geological events. It was against this background of mixture and of misunderstanding and confusion that Darwinists claim that species, not individuals, change gradually by means of natural selection over the course of thousands of millions of years. Many biologists who argue for evolution after Darwin's time assume a wrong model, according to which species have some supposed innate tendencies to evolve. Thus, if nothing happens, it was true that species evolve gradually to different species. Complex organisms cannot have been made merely by chance. Evolution does not work by chance alone. The same kind of process we see in the appearance and disappearance of civilizations. For example, what found in Tehuantepec, Mexico, I don't know where I pronounce it right. The Aztec civilizations is surrounded with mystery and questions. Where did they come from and how did they evolve is unknown because no traces of evolution are found. Now I come to my question. In VR, everything is possible. In VR, everything is possible, but the more we dig, the more the LCS has to render logic, continuous, historical, correct answers. Tom, you have two assumptions in your model. One, consciousness exists, and two, evolution exists. The existence is obvious, for me anyway, but the natural evolution, by which I mean the LCS pushed the run button combined with the rule set and initial conditions, and then let the process called evolution does the rest. How does this evolution process work in the MBT model?
Okay. See, that's an awful lot. Let's see. Where are we going to start here? All right. A lot of those, it's almost like I would say, all of above. Yeah, all of the things that you talked about, the different thoughts, they all take place to some degree. It is true that one evolves to the next, and you can find some, development along that line. And yes, that takes place. There are things that suddenly go off in a different direction. Mutations. Matter of fact, mutation is one of the central ideas in evolution, is that you have something that's progressing along and then just by chance, a mutation happens that sends it off in a totally different direction. So one should expect some sharp turns here and there. It all shouldn't be just smooth transition from one to the other. Mutations are not smooth transitions. Mutations are departures and going off in another thing. It's also true that your environmental experience can modify your genetics to the point that you do pass things on, to your children based on not only what you inherited, but what you experienced. So all of those things, I guess there's all sorts of different schools that see this and that and the other, but actually all of that does take place, together. It's not just that it's purely one thing or another. But I think what you're getting at here is probably a little different. And that is that, okay, we have the big digital bang and the simulation starts. If it seems to the system that the simulation isn't really working the way it really wanted it to build this entropy reduction trainer for IUOCs to get into and evolve. And if it turns out that that isn't happening to the degree that it should, then sure, the system would tweak that simulation a little bit. Why not? We do that. you know, we have big simulations like that in some computer science departments and universities where they give it initial conditions and a rule set, and they just let it go evolve. And, you know, eventually it runs off the track, or it explodes, or it stops evolving or something, and they go in and tweak it a little bit. They say, oh, well, we have a problem here. Yeah, let's fix that and then turn it back on.
Nudging,
so yeah, things like that are bound to happen. You know, it's hard to get something that runs as long as this has been running and not have to tweak it at all. That would be a pretty miraculous choice of rule sets, I think, to do that. So I suspect that has happened from time to time, that the system has made little interventions here and there to help the whole thing become more functional. After all, it's building a tool, you know, and, you know, some of it we can see, like the idea that there are, you know, a handful of what's called cosmic constants that all have to be exact to the 10th decimal place for our universe to be stable. And that if you just changed any one of them in the 10th decimal place, the whole universe would have, you know, self-destructed by now.
Right.
Well, to me, that's a symbol of cut and try. You know, let's try. Oh, it all fell apart. All right, let's modify, you know, let's turn gravity up a little. Let's turn down, you know, the E&M forces a little bit. Now let's go again. Oh, well, that's better, but it still bombs. And you keep doing this, refining it until you've got it tweaked out to the 10th decimal place so that all these things are just balanced in exactly the right way to make it, you know, be, you know, to keep going for a long, long time to get to where you want to go. So just that itself says it's cut and try. You cut and try and cut and try. But there's cut and try where you change things and then start over, and there's cut and try where you don't start things and change over and start over. I mean, you change things and keep going. There's also that. So yes, no doubt some of that had happened. And when it does, there's going to be breaks in the fossil record and so on. So between that and mutations, and the third thing is that all this stuff happened a long, long time ago. And the fact that we may be missing some of the footsteps, you know, we have footsteps that goes from here to here to here to here to here to here. And then suddenly there's this big blank and we see it over here. Well, maybe that's because we just haven't recovered anything from there. It doesn't mean that something miraculous happened. It could mean that that part of the fossil record, you know, some of these records are what, in the hundreds of millions of years old, if we want to go back, you know, in the earliest times. What's the probability that we don't have a complete set of all the fossil records, you know, to show it goes? That will explain some of the departures. We just don't see it. Some of those footprints are missing.
Right.
So those are three good reasons of why there's going to be discontinuities and not just these gentle things. Okay. You have sometimes some of the footprints are missing. You have the system might want to dicker with it a little to make it turn out to be a better tool. And you have the fact that randomly biology can just take a right turn and go off in some other direction because some mutation happened that was more survivable or helped us procreate in such a way that, you know, it goes one way instead of another. You know, so I would say that the idea that we could look at everything in biology and see a smooth, continuous progress from, you know, from the beginning to the end is a daydream. You know, that's not gonna happen. You know, reality doesn't work like that.
Right.
There's going to be discontinuities for multiple reasons.
Right.
So that would be my explanation of that. But it doesn't mean that those other things don't work. You know, it's not like if it doesn't work perfectly, it doesn't work at all. Yes, there are slow changes. The mutations are minor. In other words, you have a minor mutation that is advantage and another minor mutation, and that's the slow progress. But you can have a mutation that's not minor. That's a really big change, and in which case you'll go off in a different direction. So I think all of the above are true. Yes, they all happen, you know, and the sum total is what we end up with.
Right. Would you think that 65 million years ago, when a meteor hit Earth, that it was maybe arranged by the LCS because they thought that the dinosaurs and the life that was there was not good avatars for the reduction trainer?
Yeah, it could be. It could be. You know, when you have a virtual reality, you can make an asteroid just appear such that it hits just where you want it to. Or if there is an asteroid actually going to hit, you can make it disappear too, if it's going to wreak havoc with your experiment. Right. So it's a virtual reality, you know, and it's a tool. It's a useful tool. Absolutely. It's not just a game or, you know, just made for fun. It's got a reason why it has to exist. And no doubt the system will do things like that. So if it said, oh, wow, these big lizards, they dominate everything. Nothing else can get past them because everything else gets eaten. So evolution now has slowed down and we've got kind of a stasis here. We need to get rid of the big lizards because they don't make good avatars. Right. So how do you get rid of the lizards? I mean, you could just say, well, in the next frame, there won't be any more lizards. But then that leaves a big, kind of a big obvious hole. Right. Much better to have an asteroid come and you know, get rid of the lizards and let some of the mammals survive. That would be a more elegant way of solving the problem. Or maybe not. Maybe it just happened that was chance and the asteroid hit. And see, we don't know. And I guess it doesn't matter.
But if you think logically, then you would assume that it would be arranged by the LCS because the big change that happened over Earth, and if they already knew, that is also what amazes me, that the LCS, it's in its evolution was already so far that they could, you know, it's a probable future, so they cannot really know what is happening, but still they had an idea of this reduction trainer, right? Entropy reduction trainer. So they went to a certain goal, and when and like you said, it's a virtual reality, so they can even you know, go back 3 steps without us knowing it and start again at a certain point, you know. But it has to be historical correct, right? It has to be logically, it has to be continuous. As long as there is no problem there, then they can, or they listen to me, but the LCS can do whatever it wants then, I guess, right?
Yes, and right now there's a whole lot of well-educated people with microscopes and telescopes that are keeping track of things like that. So the system has to even be more careful about not doing things that people can notice that, you know, aren't the way they're supposed to be. But if you go back, you know, 1 million years ago, it could be pretty heavy-handed and it wouldn't have made any difference, you know. It wouldn't have made any difference at all.
But the civilizations, though, Tom, like an Aztec civilization or the Egypts, they have so many mysteries there. It almost seemed that they had a higher quality of consciousness than we have now, because they built the pyramids we can even build at this time, you know. There's so many mystery there.
Yeah, there are a lot of mysteries there. And again, we just don't know, you know, how that comes about. But, you know, in earlier times, they had some advantages too. And that is that they weren't a technological society, which means they weren't encouraged for this intellectual dominance that we have now, which means they developed their intuitive side probably much more readily and much more strongly than we did, do, because we say, what intuition? There's no such thing as intuition. BS, that's all BS. That's weak-minded woo-woo people think there's intuition, you know, it's just the physical world and that's it. Well, we are probably not nearly as well developed intuitively, which is where all the paranormal stuff is, as people were even 1,000 years ago, much less, 10 or 20,000 years ago, because they didn't have this propensity to be intellectually dominated.
Right.
It's so who knows what might have happened. Yeah.
That's where the world is a little bit out of balance, right? I mean, and it could have been, and there are too many lefties now, as they call them, but maybe in the Egypt times they were out of balance. There was too much intuition.
Could be. Could be that got carried away and started being used for negative things rather than for positive things.
Right.
I'm sure all of that happened.
All right, Tom. Thanks very much.
Mm-hmm.